The city of Jackson is home to two new museums that you shouldn't miss the next time you're in town. It's where you'll find the story of Mississippi, blemishes and all. But it's our story, and we're sharing it with the world and future generations in a spectacular way. Joining us today is the director of the Museum of Mississippi History, Rachel Myers. Also, Mississippi Civil Rights History Museum Director, Pamela Jr. Both museums fall under the auspices of the Department of Archives and History and its director, Katie Blount. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I feel like I should have champagne and, confetti falling from the sky. But I think a great place to start in the beginning, and we'll kind of do the genesis here of the two museums, because I think the story of how they came to be is almost as fascinating. It can almost be an exhibit in the museum. It's been a really interesting story.
The Department of Archives and History has had the State Historical Museum for generations. Of course, most people remember visiting the History Museum in the old Capitol. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina tore the roof off the old Capitol. We closed the building, moved all of the artifacts into storage, and went to the legislature and requested the funds to restore the old Capitol. We did, and it reopened in 2009 as a museum interpreting the history of the events that happened there and Mississippi's different constitutions, and but it's no longer the State History Museum. We had already been seeking funding to build a new state history museum before 2005 because we'd outgrown the old Capitol. But that effort was stalled. The economy was down, and the focus was on recovering from the storm. Meanwhile, Governor Haley Barbour had initiated an effort in the private sector to build a civil rights museum with money raised privately. That effort was also stalled. And Governor William Winter and Judge Reuben Anderson went to Governor Barbour in 2010 and proposed the idea of building the two museums together, joining them in one building, building them in downtown Jackson under the Department of Archives and History. And he liked that idea and got behind it in a big way. And of course, there had been people working for both of these museums for many years. There had been a lot of interest in the Civil Rights Museum in the legislature. And Governor Barbour announced his support for combining the museums and worked with the legislature to come up with the initial funding, $40 million in bond funding to begin the construction project, and we were off and running.
Now, the collection, the state collection, is the second oldest state collection, I believe?
It's the second oldest. The Department of Archives and History is the second oldest comprehensive state historical agency in the country, after 1 year nearer than Alabama. And the department has the finest collection in the world of artifacts and documents relating to Mississippi history. And of course, both of the museums draw very heavily on the collection. The artifacts that you see are all from our collection, and many of the images are. And of course, much of the research was done not only at the archives, but the archival staff who were so familiar with our collections were very closely involved in planning the exhibits.
To think of that collection, and then you put it in storage, and then you have the Civil Rights Museum coming in, and then you get everything passed, and you're thinking, okay, now we're going to build it. What do we do next? I mean, that's like, yay, we got it done. Now,
two museums.
Yeah, two museums, and we've got 15,000 artifacts. How are we going to fit them in here? So,
it was
or 1,500 artifacts.
Quite a project.
Yeah. How did that process go?
Basically, in 2011, we did a national search for exhibit teams to make the plans for the exhibits. We worked very closely with them, along with community advisors from across the state, scholars, civil rights veterans. We worked closely with the Choctaw and the Chickasaw to shape these stories and make sure that everybody's voices were included in these museums. It was a fascinating process, and we had a lot of help. We had public meetings across the state to get people's input. And then we had, once the plans were drawn up, then we did another national search for fabricator fabricators to come in and build the exhibits. Meanwhile, Thrash Construction was building the building all during this process. And also, meanwhile, we were going back to the legislature. I mean, we never asked for more money than we had initially, but it was funded in phases. And so all of these processes were going on at once. And I think we all got a real lift when Pamela Jr. and Rachel Myers joined us toward the end of the planning, and they really helped us shape the way we opened and the way we've been greeting visitors, and that was when things started to get a lot of fun.
Did both of you come on about the stage when the shell of the building was there and you looked in and you saw an empty floor space and say, okay, now let's get everything?
It was a little bit more than just a shell of a building when we got
well, I mean, the floor was there. Yeah. Well, the lights were on. But telling a story is, especially one as complex as ours, isn't easy, and to do it right. And one thing I will say, and this is not only from my point of view, but this is from all the reviews, both museums are honest. And they tell a story, and I think that's the way it should be. I mean, how did that narrative get woven?
Well, of course, they had your scholars who wanted to make sure that the information was chronologically and was on those walls correct.
Yeah.
As I tell people all the time, is that when you come into the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, you see the ills of Mississippi on the walls. What are we going to do with those ills once we finish going through the museum? But it was amazing how they came through and actually chronologically put this information together, especially in the Civil Rights Museum, of course, in the Mississippi Museum of History.
Yeah, there are some incredibly powerful moments in the Civil Rights Museum where you see the number of people that were lynched, for instance. And so you go through and it just kind of grips you, but by the time you walk out of there, you feel like you need to go do something.
The last gallery is where do we go from here?
Right.
And that gallery is really dear to my heart because I put my foot in that gallery. But it really, when I think about where do we go from here, I always think about, Martin Luther King, one of his last books, 1967, he wrote, where do we go from here, community or chaos?
Right.
And so he was looking into the future and wanting us to kind of look at this thing a little bit differently. And here we are now. I think about how people were asking, what do we do now? Martin is dead. Who is going to be our Moses?
Yeah.
And that's what was said in the Black community. But here's the thing. They're mirrors. We look at our own selves. We do the work. So I think people are going out honestly and saying, okay, what am I going to do in my community? How am I going to mentor? That's a wonderful thing about going through that museum, is that at the end, you're charged.
Well, that's what I was going to say about the Civil Rights Museum, but I guess both museums, even though that covers a period of time, I mean, there's a snapshot in a window of time, it's really a living museum. Both of them are living museums because our story is always changing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think in a history museum, our task is for us to find our own role in Mississippi history. So as you're moving chronologically through these galleries, you start to think about your ancestors and your people and the way that now we are in making history currently. And again, where do we go from here? What is our label going to say on the wall?
What's so great about it too, and I mean, I heard at one point that there was going to be an effort to get like every ninth grader in the state through the museum. And what's so important, I guess, for ninth graders is that they understand how the history of the state has shaped who they are too. And I think you get that from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, they are coming from all over the state.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we have stories about the Gulf Coast, we have stories about the Delta, we have stories about the hills. So not only are you learning about your own community, but the diversity of the Mississippi experience, not only racially, but also geographically.
Ballpark, how many square feet do you have in your museum?
It's about 20,000 square feet of exhibition space.
Okay, so you got to get every region of the state for about 15,000 years crammed in there. I thought my house was a little bit tight.
That was the charge. And
Yeah.
most of it is based off of our collection. As
Yeah.
Katie said, we've been collecting since 1902, so we are lucky to have a variety.
Mississippi has an awesome addict.
And now
It really does. Yeah. We have a great addict.
But a
We got-
huge place to showcase it now.
Yeah.
And that all of these artifacts, whether it's the huge carriage or a tiny pin or a plate, those stories are elevated. They're on a huge scale, a national level. People from all over the country are now coming and rediscovering the story of Mississippi, the narrative that they might have thought we're working on it in that space.
The emotional feelings that people come out with, and you see the crying, you see the tears, and the lynching monoliths, and how one gentleman actually found a family member, and he said that his mother had been looking, the family had been looking for his uncle, for her uncle, and it was his great uncle, and he saw it in 1935. That name was there. That's what happens in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum.
That's really
And
powerful.
emotions in the,
Yeah.
in the History Museum.
Yeah.
I enjoy watching generations go through. So we like over winter break, we had all these families, and it's grandparents all of a sudden talking about stories about their home communities and their butter churn and their wash tub and sharecropping, and you can just see it in the eyes of these kids that they've never heard these stories before.
Right.
So that both these museums create a venue to start these conversations that are now influencing the way that Mississippians are in their home communities.
I heard an older lady say, "That canoe, I remember that canoe from the old
Just taking stories from the
So it's
museum,
like
yeah.
even some of the exhibits are famous.
Yes,
So,
yes.
on that. You talk about, the importance of the Civil Rights Museum in the timing and everything. I mean, the generation that fought that battle, they're like almost like the greatest generation with the World War II Museum down in New Orleans. I mean, they're starting to fade into history. So it's so important. It was so important to get this done now. Not only to let them to be able to see it, but also to get their oral histories. I mean, that's got to be a big part of it, too.
And we're talking about that. We want to work on that to get that. We have to do the oral history. We just had one to pass, a veteran just to pass the other day from Hattiesburg.
Right.
And so for me, I'm like, okay. And we saw her when we opened. We had a night for civil rights veterans to come in, and she came in a wheelchair. And I will never forget her look when she saw her young self in the Hattiesburg Voices. So those are the moments that we say we truly love our job because we're here, we're at that moment in time that'll never happen again. And that's what we've been going through. Just today we had a group of kids and they got in the rotunda in Gallery 3 and This Little Light of Mine, and they were singing and stomping their feet and I was like, this is amazing to have that. So it's just a place that you want to be.
Right.
Go on.
No, go ahead.
It's a place that you want to be because you feel what the veterans felt.
Yeah.
Because those young folks that marched and protested for folks like little old me to be up here sitting, that's amazing. So for me, that's an honor. So I live being in honor every day that I get up coming to work.
I'm having a memory moment, and I apologize. I interviewed her on the radio show. She helped with voting registration up in Canton. You might be able to. Fonzie.
Yes,
Fonzie. Thank you.
Goodlow, right.
I think it was Fonzie, but I'm not sure.
It was, yeah.
It
Must have been.
Yes.
She hosted Martin Luther King at her house.
Yes.
And she still had the dishes
China
at the end.
dishes,
The China dishes.
yes.
And she talked about it almost like it was like the Shroud of Turin.
It is.
Yeah. I mean, it was just, but you felt the power
Yes.
of what that experience must have been like for her,
Yes.
just her talking about the dishes.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And just to hear them talk, to hear Hollis Watkins talk about a moment when he was in jail and they told him he could leave out. And he knew from his training, no, if I leave out, I'm gonna get shot in the back. So students today were talking to him, and one little guy said, well, I'll run. And he was like, no, let me tell you why you wouldn't run. So those are the moments when you're bringing these generations together and they're able to learn from each other. That's going to be great that we're going to do this and bring them together so they can talk. And because for these veterans, they're saying the struggle continues.
Right.
And then you have these young folks who may not even understand
that. They're still struggling.
They're still struggling.
Right.
So I look forward to bringing that together.
And I've discovered this through having my own children and through teaching, and I mean, kids learn differently today. So you can't just do a museum of stuffed animals with a big long piece of text. The exhibit in the Civil Rights Museum with the gun that killed Medgar Evers.
Yes.
The way that's set up. And could you describe how that's set up? I don't want to give too much of the museum away because I want people to come visit it, obviously.
Oh,
It's
please,
very
yes.
powerful how it goes through like stages and then the light turns on.
Yeah, it's amazing how they did that film.
Yeah.
To be able to sit there and you feel like you're surrounded by Medgar Evers.
Yeah.
To be able to hear his voice, because there's not a lot of times when you heard his voice being
That's
on
right.
TV, and just to hear how he sounded, because you see his voice, his mouth moving. So for me, that's amazing right there. But then as you're sitting there and they talk about that day, that night when he came home and the family was inside the house, and then you hear that gunshot, and then all of a sudden the rifle lights up. And for those who don't know, We've had questions from young folks. Well, what is this for? Why is there a rifle in here? So that's a teaching moment for us. And it's a lot of teaching moments.
You catch their attention.
Yes.
Yeah. How powerful was it to be there when Myrlie Evers came and when the Damer family came and were able to see it for the first time? Because you got to think they never expected to see something like this in their lifetime.
Well, each moment, each time wasn't a tear, an eye that wasn't filled with tears, because it was emotional for Myrlie, and she kept saying, "Look at my baby. That's my baby," talking about Mecca. And what it does is bring it home.
Yeah.
That's a family. This is what happened to this man who gave his life, and it was a family left behind. And then with Mrs. Damer, oh my goodness, that was so powerful when she said, "I could still feel the flames of that night." And for her oldest son to just be in that moment, it was something for all of us, I think. It really was. It was a lot for us. I couldn't go home that day. I just had to keep driving for a long time because it was so emotional.
I made the joke a little bit earlier. You had a little bit of snow on the day of the opening, and I said that there must have been somebody in 1965 walking up Capitol Street, and he said the day Mississippi has a civil rights museum, that Jackson will freeze over.
Well,
and there you go. You got several inches of snow.
Yeah,
That was a big day, though. That was a big day, and you talk about a little bit about that, because I mean, here you've been working and working and working, and suddenly the doors get open, and you're like, oh no, now what?
It was a real thrill to finally, after all of these years, be able to welcome the people into the museums. And Governor Bryant and Mrs. Evers walked in together, and Governor Winter walked in together with a group of children.
Yeah.
And there was this huge crowd behind them waiting to come in. And Saturday was really hectic, and my favorite memories are from Sunday afternoon, when I would walk around the galleries and just be watching, as Rachel described earlier, people experiencing these museums, and that was really gratifying and exciting. And it's also a lot of fun for us to hear people's thoughts about it. We're very determined to continue to collect people's stories. I mean, the family stories that we've talked about that people share when they're in the museums, those are Mississippi history. So we have a recording booth where people can share them, and then we'll incorporate them into the exhibits. And
right,
Rachel's
museum, and it's amazing. So just these last few weeks, there's hundreds of videos that have been recorded, and it's all sorts of folks, intergenerational, or people talking about what's special about their hometown. So all sorts of folks are bragging about Brookhaven and Crystal Springs and Coveport, and they're filled with pride now for their place that they came through the museum and instilled in it. So now visitors can come and see those stories as well.
Well, you've been able to walk through the museum and several times. I want to hear all three of you what your favorite exhibits are in the museum. So I know it's like saying which one's your favorite kid. I get that. I understand that. But I mean, what are some of the exhibits that really jump out, and when you saw them for the first time, you just went, wow?
Well, it's in the Civil Rights Museum. I mean, every single exhibit is so powerful, but to stand in the Central Gallery and look at the faces of the heroes of the movement and the martyrs of the movement and hear the veterans singing, that experience is really hard to top. There are so many exhibits I'm so proud of in the History Museum. I love the reproduction of Mount Helm Church and the film that is shown in there. I love to stand up on the balcony and look down at the exhibits below and watch the people walk through. I'm really also partial to the culture, the gallery, the gallery that focuses on art, and you see Eudora Welty's typewriter and some Native American baskets and folk art, and there's a little juke joint in there. I could go on and on. I just can't choose one.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's Gallery 6, I Question America, and there's a church. And that's my place of solitude, to go in there and hear Fannie Lou Hamer singing This Little Light of Mine. It just goes, it really goes through me. And so for me, That's not only a hideout. I'm telling my hideout, but that's just a place. Yeah, that's just a place to really reflect on where we are today, and it's a quiet space. Even though the film is really something else, but it's amazing just to be in that church.
Just as long as the staff doesn't watch this episode, and they'll know where to find you.
Yeah, they'll know where to find
Exactly.
They will.
We can edit it out. No problem.
I appreciate you.
See, I'm opposite. I like the places where I could be chatty. So there's these spaces that are called How We Live. So it's interiors of homes throughout history, and it's the Benton House in Turkey Creek, or it's a rail car from the lumber industry, and so I'll kind of casually stand up and be like, what do you think that's about? Like, what do you think you do in that? And it's, an old tub, or like, what do you think those tools are for? And so it's a place to elicit those conversations with visitors. So that's usually where I'm hanging out, is talking about people's homes and what's similar to yours and what's different.
One of the things I loved about moving to Mississippi, and I'm a newcomer, I moved here 21 years ago, but I love the fact that just about anywhere you go, there's some significant piece of history in the United States, is somewhere in the state. I mean, there's just such a story to tell. One of the things, though, when they were talking about where to put it, when they decided where to put it, I always joked that they should put a little window in the building and open it up, because then you can see down where when the Freedom Riders came in, they were housed down on the fairgrounds. I think that's great symbolism that it's up and over that location.
That is great symbolism.
Was that an accident, or was that planned?
I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I wouldn't say it was an accident.
Yeah. We had the space, and
that was state-owned land downtown next to the archives, but we did realize from the beginning the significance of that location in relation to the history that happened on the fairgrounds.
Yeah.
The civil rights workers held there.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. All right, so y'all held your breath. You got it open, you got everybody in, the reviews started coming out. You had to feel almost like, you just put on this giant play and the New York Times was going to write the review. I don't think I read a bad review. I mean, everything that I read was really positive. I mean, how high off the ground were y'all walking? Yeah.
I mean, it was a great feeling, and
Yeah.
I really credit it to, again, the huge number of people who gave their time and perspective, and because of the large, first of all, because of the generosity of the legislature and the leadership of the four governors who supported this project, including Governor Bryant and the legislature, we had the resources to build really Smithsonian quality museums, and that I think has surprised people, just the scale and quality of the museums, and then the huge number of voices who participated in telling their stories and making sure that we got it right. I was very pleased with the reviews, but in the end, when I think about that process and all the people who helped with it, I'm not surprised.
The reviews are good, but I think even word of mouth was even better. I mean, I just look at the chatter on social media, and people all across, from no matter white, black, tall, short, no matter what, everybody loved it. And it's like your crowds just started building and building and building.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right.
You just came off of a weekend where, of course, it was free open admission. I'll get you to tell why that was free open, because I think that's a great story in itself. But my sons were like, hey, Dad, let's go down to the museum. I said, that's great. And they got a Snapchat of a picture of the line wrapping halfway around Jackson. They said, can we go next weekend? What a great problem to have.
It was amazing. The Kellogg Foundation, which has been a strong sponsor, one of our first donors and one of our biggest donor from the very beginning, got behind this project, and they called us a few days before Martin Luther King weekend and said, we want to help y'all offer free admission and we'll underwrite it. And we said, great, and we put the word out, and the response was unbelievable. We had 16,000 people through the museums that weekend, and as you said, Marcia, the line stretched out the front door, down to the sidewalk, down to the Winter Building, and past it to the corner all day Saturday.
Yeah,
and all day Monday.
All day Monday, too,
Yeah.
And you had an estimate for the year, how many people you'd hoped? And you are getting close to that estimate in the first
Mississippi
month.
Development Authority helped us project 180,000 visitors a year. And so far, here in midway through February, we've had 60,000 visitors. So
Wow.
It's great. Thank you, all the visitors who come see us.
And all the workers and
museums.
all the volunteers are saying, oh, we're going to take the next 3 months off.
Well,
So you're
sadly,
actually- I
nobody
saw-
has had any time.
No, actually, I saw where you were going to request a little bit more money so that you
Yes,
can, because
yes.
that's
Yes,
very important.
We had the legislature's been very generous, but we had sort of had an understanding that that for the first year we would request only the sort of minimum operating expenses to have enough staff to welcome people in, and then we'd kind of see where we went from there. And I am going back and saying, okay, huge crowds, people working all the time. You know, I had to work the front desk for a while, which I was not very good at, complicated computer system. So we do need some more help, and I feel like the legislature will be there for us as they have been from the beginning of this project, and Governor too has been a strong supporter.
Yeah, and that's been really great seeing just across the board everybody jumping in behind you. It reminds me of the end of Field of Dreams. You know, build it and they will come, and boy, they have come.
Well, now we realize people have a hunger for it. I mean,
Yes.
they are
They
waiting for hours in line to
Right.
come to these museums. You know, Mississippi now is a museum spot, and so we
Right.
need the programming and the new exhibits to satisfy them.
Right, and I think a lot of it's because the fact that we are finally getting to tell our own story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Go
go on. But the wonderful thing about it is that these two museums, but we have these other wonderful museums throughout the state of Mississippi, in which they're going to get greater visitation now. So that's what's so great about it.
Yeah, we highlight the other museums and cultural and historical attractions in our exhibits. So when you read about Medgar Evers, you see a sign about the Evers House, and when you read about when you see the swinging bridge at Tishomingo State Park, you see a little sign about how to visit Tishomingo State Park. All kinds of sites throughout the state. We see this as a starting point. And a connector to all the wonderful, you know, this is a boom time in Mississippi for museums and cultural attractions and the heritage and cultural trails. People have always been interested in Mississippi and our stories. Our stories are richer and more complex and more important in some ways than many states. And people have always had a hunger, and now it's easier for them to come and learn about Mississippi.
Well, I appreciate y'all coming in today and telling this amazing story of these two fantastic museums. Thank y'all so much
Thank
for coming
you.
here today.
Thank you.